Sarah had always seen Mr. Peterson as a fixture in her life, like the oak tree in her front yard. He'd lived next door since she was a baby, always ready with a kind smile and a Werther's original. He was the grandfather she never had, teaching her to ride her bike, helping her with tricky math problems, even patiently explaining the mysteries of lawn care. Now, at 18, she technically wasn't a child anymore, a fact that had begun to dawn on her in recent weeks. She found herself noticing things she hadn't before, the way the afternoon sun caught the silver in his hair, the gentle crinkling around his eyes when he laughed, the quiet strength in his hands. It wasn't a crush, not exactly. More like a curiosity. Mr. Peterson, for his part, remained the same steady presence. He tended his garden, waved hello from his porch, and occasionally brought over freshly baked cookies. He was a good neighbor, a good man. But lately Sarah had been feeling restless, a little bored with the predictable rhythm of her life. She craved something different, something interesting. So, when she noticed the persistent drip, drip, drip beneath her kitchen sink, she knew exactly who to call. Not a plumber. Mr. Peterson. It was the perfect excuse to shake things up a bit. After all, he was always happy to lend a hand, and she was always happy for the company. The stage was set. The phone felt almost too light in Sarah's hand as she dialed Mr. Peterson's number. She imagined him in his garden, tending to his prize-winning roses, a gentle smile on his face. He always answered on the second ring. "Hello, Peterson residence," he'd say, his voice warm and familiar. She rehearsed her lines in her head. "Mr. Peterson, it's Sarah. I was wondering if you might be able to help me with something." She'd make her voice sound distressed, a damsel in need. Not too much, though. She didn't want him to worry. The phone rang once. Twice. "Hello? Mr. Peterson?" "Hi, it's Sarah." She put just a touch of panic in her tone. "I have a little emergency." "Sarah, dear! What's wrong?" His voice was instantly concerned. "It's my sink," she explained. "It's leaking really badly. I don't know anything about plumbing, and I'm afraid it's going to flood the whole kitchen." She exaggerated slightly, but not by much. The drip was definitely annoying. "Oh dear, that doesn't sound good. Don't worry, I'll be right over. Just show me where the shut-off valve is, and I'll take a look." "Oh, thank you, Mr. Peterson. You're a lifesaver." She feigned relief, knowing she was laying it on a bit thick, but enjoying the role nonetheless. "I'll be waiting." She hung up the phone, a small smile playing on her lips. The game had begun. Barely 10 minutes later, a familiar knock echoed through Sarah's small house. She took a deep breath, smoothed down her hair, and opened the door. Mr. Peterson stood on her porch, a well-worn toolbox in hand and a kind smile on his face. "All right, Sarah, let's see what we've got here," he said, stepping inside. He surveyed the kitchen with a practiced eye, taking in the sun-drenched space with its cheerful yellow walls and mismatched chairs. It was a cozy room, filled with the scent of cinnamon and old books. "It's under here," Sarah said, gesturing towards the sink. She pointed out the shut-off valve, trying to remember what he had told her about it years ago. He nodded, his gaze lingering on her for a moment longer than necessary, she thought. "I'll need a wrench and a bucket," he said, his voice slightly gruffer than usual. He opened his toolbox, revealing an array of gleaming tools, each one meticulously organized. He was a man who took pride in his work. Sarah retrieved the bucket from the pantry, her heart pounding slightly faster than it should. As she handed it to him, their fingers brushed, and she felt a strange jolt, a spark of something unexpected. "Thank you, dear," he murmured, his eyes meeting hers. And in that moment Sarah knew that things were about to get a lot more complicated. The leaky sink was just the beginning. Mr. Peterson knelt awkwardly before the open cabinet beneath the sink. The cramped space forced him to hunch over, his brow furrowed in concentration. Sarah pulled up a kitchen chair, positioning it so she could observe him without being directly in his way. "So, what have you been up to lately, Sarah?" he asked, his voice muffled by the cabinet. He was fiddling with a pipe, his movements precise and deliberate. "Not much, really," she replied, feigning nonchalance. "Just trying to figure out what I want to do with my life." She knew he'd understand. He'd always been a source of gentle advice. "That's a big question," he said, chuckling softly. "Don't rush it. Take your time and explore your options." "Easier said than done," she sighed. She watched as a bead of sweat trickled down his temple. He was working hard. "The pressure from my parents is definitely on. Parents always want what's best," he said, his voice laced with a hint of wistfulness. "Even if they don't always know what that is." They lapsed into a comfortable silence, punctuated only by the clinking of tools and the occasional drip of water. The sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. It was a peaceful scene, a tableau of domesticity. But beneath the surface, a current of unease began to simmer. Sarah knew she couldn't prolong the small talk forever. It was time to drop the bomb. She cleared her throat, trying to sound casual. "Actually, Mr. Peterson," she began, "today is a pretty special day for me." He paused, his wrench hovering midair. "Oh? What's so special about today?" His voice was carefully neutral. "Well," she said, drawing out the word, "it's my birthday." She paused, letting the information sink in. "I turned 18. The silence that followed was deafening. Mr. Peterson remained frozen beneath the sink, his back to her. She could practically feel the tension radiating from him. The clinking of the wrench had stopped completely. 18, he finally repeated, his voice barely a whisper. She couldn't see his face, but she imagined the gears turning in his head, the implications of her words slowly dawning on him. She waited, her breath held captive in her chest. The air in the kitchen seemed to thicken, charged with unspoken possibilities. The sunlight, once warm and inviting, now felt like a spotlight, illuminating every detail of their awkward tableau. "Well, happy birthday, Sarah," he said at last, his voice regaining some of its former steadiness. I didn't realize." He cleared his throat. "That's wonderful." But something in his tone betrayed him. A flicker of something unreadable, something that sent a shiver down Sarah's spine. She had his attention now. The game was truly afoot. As if on cue, or perhaps as a physical manifestation of his inner turmoil, Mr. Peterson bumped his head sharply on the underside of the sink. A loud "Oof!" escaped his lips. "Oh my gosh, Mr. Peterson! Are you okay?" Sarah exclaimed, jumping up from her chair, feigning concern. She rushed to his side, peering into the dimly lit space beneath the counter. He rubbed his head gingerly. Yes, I'm fine," he mumbled, his face flushed. But Sarah noticed more than just the bump. A crimson tide was rising from his neck, spreading across his cheeks. He was blushing, deeply and unmistakably. "Here, let me see," she insisted, reaching out to touch his forehead. Her fingers brushed against his skin, and she felt a surprising heat. He flinched slightly, pulling away from her touch. "Really, I'm all right," he said, avoiding her gaze. He scrambled to his feet, banging his knee on the cabinet door in the process. He seemed unusually clumsy, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. Sarah watched him carefully, a knowing smile playing on her lips. The birthday bomb had worked its magic. The grandfatherly facade was cracking, revealing something else beneath the surface. Something vulnerable, something human. The tension in the kitchen was now thick enough to cut with a knife. And she was just getting started. "Well," Mr. Peterson said, attempting a hearty laugh that fell flat. "That was a bit clumsy of me, wasn't it? Guess I'm not as young as I used to be." He rubbed the back of his neck, still avoiding eye contact. Sarah leaned against the counter, crossing her arms. "You're still pretty spry for your age, Mr. Peterson," she said, her voice laced with a subtle flirtatiousness. She watched his reaction closely. He coughed, a nervous little sound. "Well, thank you, Sarah. I appreciate that." He bent back down to the sink, resuming his work with renewed vigor. But his hands were trembling slightly, she noticed. The conversation shifted, subtly but irrevocably. The innocent banter about the weather and his garden was gone, replaced by a different kind of energy. Sarah began to ask him questions about his past, about his life before retirement. She coaxed him to talk about his late wife, his voice softening as he recalled fond memories. But even in these seemingly innocuous topics, Sarah managed to inject a new layer of meaning. She asked about his regrets, his unfulfilled dreams, the things he wished he had done differently. She was probing, searching for vulnerabilities, testing the boundaries of their relationship. And Mr. Peterson, despite his obvious discomfort, seemed unable to resist her subtle prodding. He answered her questions, slowly and thoughtfully, his gaze occasionally flickering towards her, a mixture of confusion and something else, something that Sarah couldn't quite decipher. The air crackled with unspoken desires, a silent conversation unfolding beneath the surface of their words. "You know," Sarah said, leaning closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "I always thought you were so handsome when I was little." She batted her eyelashes, exaggerating the effect. Mr. Peterson coughed again, this time a more genuine sound of surprise. "Sarah, dear, you shouldn't say such things." But his eyes lingered on her face for a beat longer than necessary. "Why not?" she teased. "It's the truth. All the girls in the neighborhood had a crush on you." He chuckled nervously. "Well, I was a bit of a heartthrob back in my day," he admitted, a hint of pride in his voice. Sarah seized the opportunity. "See? I knew it! You still got it, Mr. Peterson." She winked. He shook his head, but a smile played on his lips. He was clearly enjoying the attention, despite his protestations. "Speaking of being a heartthrob," Sarah continued, her voice laced with innuendo, "did you ever get into any trouble with all those admirers?" Mr. Peterson paused, his eyes widening slightly. "Trouble?" he repeated, his voice suddenly tight. "Yeah," Sarah said, her gaze locking with his. "You know, did any of them ever try to take advantage of your handyman skills?" She let the words hang in the air, heavy with double meaning. The tension in the kitchen was now almost unbearable. The game was escalating, and Sarah was eager to see how far Mr. Peterson was willing to play. A mischievous glint sparkled in Sarah's eyes. "Remember that time I fell out of the tree in your yard?" she asked, a nostalgic smile on her face. Mr. Peterson chuckled, the sound strained. "How could I forget? You gave your mother quite a scare. You were the one who climbed up and rescued me," Sarah reminded him, her voice soft. "I was so scared, but you made me feel safe." The memory hung in the air, innocent on the surface, but now tinged with a new, unsettling awareness. Sarah had been 8 years old then, a child in need of rescuing. Now, 10 years later, she was 18, a woman, and the nature of the rescue had changed. "You were always so good with kids, Mr. Peterson," she said, her voice husky. "You have a real, nurturing side." She let her gaze drift down his body, lingering for a moment on his hands, calloused and strong. He shifted uncomfortably, his face growing even redder. "Well, I always tried to be a good neighbor," he mumbled, focusing intently on the pipe he was working on. "You were more than just a good neighbor," Sarah insisted, her voice dripping with honeyed sweetness. "You were a hero." She paused, letting the word resonate between them. "And I never really thanked you properly for that." The implication hung heavy in the air. Perhaps now was the time to rectify that omission. The past was no longer just the past. It was a weapon, a tool to be wielded in this dangerous game of seduction. Mr. Peterson was sweating now, beads of perspiration clinging to his forehead. He gripped the wrench tightly, his knuckles white. He seemed determined to avoid Sarah's gaze, focusing all his attention on the intricate network of pipes beneath the sink. He cleared his throat again. "Well, I'm just glad I could help, Sarah," he said, his voice strained. "It's what neighbors do." Sarah watched him, her expression unreadable. She could see the internal battle raging within him, the struggle between his ingrained sense of morality and the undeniable pull of desire. He was a good man, she knew that. But even the best of men had their weaknesses. "You're being awfully quiet, Mr. Peterson," she said, her voice soft and teasing. "What are you thinking about?" He didn't answer, his silence only amplifying the tension in the room. He tightened a bolt with unnecessary force, the metal groaning under the pressure. He was clearly trying to regain control, to reassert the boundaries that Sarah was so deliberately blurring. But it was a losing battle. The birthday bomb had been dropped, the childhood memories twisted, the suggestive comments made. The genie was out of the bottle, and there was no putting it back in. Mr. Peterson was caught in a web of his own making, and Sarah was the spider, patiently waiting for him to succumb. The air grew heavy, thick with unspoken longing and the intoxicating scent of forbidden fruit. "You know, Mr. Peterson," Sarah said, rising from her chair and taking a step closer to him, "I've always admired your hands. They're so strong and capable." She reached out and gently touched his arm, her fingers tracing the outline of his bicep. "They can fix anything, can't they?" He flinched at her touch, his body stiffening. He pulled away slightly, his eyes darting nervously around the room. "Sarah, please," he stammered, his voice barely audible. "This isn't appropriate." But Sarah pressed on undeterred. "What's not appropriate?" she asked, her voice innocent. "I'm just admiring your handiwork. You're the best handyman in the neighborhood." She took another step closer, invading his personal space. "Sarah, I think I should get back to work," he said, his voice trembling slightly. He bent down again, resuming his task with a desperate intensity. But Sarah wasn't finished. She leaned down, her face close to his ear. "Tell me, Mr. Peterson," she whispered, her breath warm against his skin. "What else can those hands do?" He gasped, his body convulsing. He dropped the wrench with a loud clang, the sound echoing through the small kitchen. Sarah had finally pushed him too far. The game was about to reach its climax. The wrench lay on the floor between them, a symbol of the shattered pretense. Mr. Peterson stood frozen, his chest heaving, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and something else, something Sarah couldn't quite name. I need to go," he stammered, taking a step back. I shouldn't be here." Sarah blocked his path, her expression softening, but her eyes still holding a spark of defiance. "Don't go, Mr. Peterson," she said, her voice pleading. "Please! We need to talk." He shook his head, his gaze fixed on the floor. "There's nothing to talk about, Sarah. This was a mistake. A terrible mistake." "Was it, though?" Sarah challenged, taking a step closer. "Or was it just inevitable?" He flinched, as if she had struck him. He looked up at her, his eyes filled with anguish. "Don't do this, Sarah," he begged. "Please. You're too young. I'm too old. It's wrong." "But does it feel wrong?" Sarah whispered, reaching out and gently touching his cheek. Her fingers traced the lines etched around his eyes, the lines that spoke of a life lived, of joys and sorrows. "Does it, Mr. Peterson?" He closed his eyes, his body trembling. He leaned into her touch for just a moment, then pulled away sharply, as if burned. "Yes, it does," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "It's all wrong." And in that moment Sarah knew she had gone too far. She had pushed him to the brink, forced him to confront desires he had long suppressed. And in doing so, she had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Sarah stepped back, giving Mr. Peterson the space he so desperately needed. He bent down and picked up the wrench, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't look at her, his gaze fixed on the task at hand. He worked in silence for a few minutes, his brow furrowed in concentration. Sarah watched him, her heart pounding in her chest. She had wanted excitement, she had wanted to shake things up, but she hadn't anticipated the fallout, the raw emotion that now hung heavy in the air. Finally, he straightened up, wiping his hands on a rag. "There," he said, his voice flat. "It's fixed. No more leak." He turned on the faucet, and a steady stream of water flowed into the sink. No drips, no leaks. The practical problem had been solved. But the real problem, the one that now loomed between them, was far from resolved. The fixed sink was a stark symbol of their situation. The initial issue had been addressed, but in its place, a much larger, more complicated problem had emerged. A problem that threatened to shatter their comfortable, familiar world. Mr. Peterson turned off the faucet, his gaze still avoiding hers. "I should go," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Sarah nodded, unable to speak. The weight of her actions pressed down on her, a heavy burden of guilt and regret. She had opened Pandora's box, and now she had to face the consequences. The kitchen, once a haven of warmth and cinnamon, now felt cold and sterile, a battleground where innocence had been lost and boundaries irrevocably crossed. The comfortable chatter that had once filled Sarah's kitchen was gone, replaced by a suffocating silence. The air was thick with unspoken words, with regret and shame and a hint of lingering desire. Mr. Peterson began to gather his tools, his movements stiff and mechanical. He carefully placed each item back in its designated spot in the toolbox, as if performing a sacred ritual. He avoided Sarah's gaze, his eyes darting nervously around the room. Sarah watched him, her heart aching. She had wanted to shake things up, to feel something, but she hadn't realized the cost. She had jeopardized a friendship that had spanned her entire life, a bond that had provided her with comfort and support. The weight of her actions pressed down on her, a heavy burden of guilt and remorse. She longed to rewind time, to erase the past few hours, to return to the innocent, uncomplicated relationship they had once shared. But it was too late. The genie was out of the bottle, and there was no putting it back in. The silence stretched between them, an unbridgeable chasm that threatened to swallow them both. Mr. Peterson snapped the toolbox shut, the sound echoing through the room like a gunshot. He stood up, his shoulders slumped, his face etched with weariness. He looked like a man who had aged 10 years in a single afternoon. The silence screamed between them, a testament to the damage that had been done. What would she say? What could she say? The answers eluded her. He edged towards the door, his hand reaching for the knob. Sarah knew she had to say something, anything, to break the suffocating silence. But the words caught in her throat, trapped by a mixture of guilt and fear. "Mr. Peterson," she finally managed to croak out, her voice barely audible. He paused, his hand still on the doorknob, but he didn't turn around. "Yes, Sarah?" he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. She took a deep breath, trying to compose herself. "Thank you," she said, her voice stronger now. "For fixing the sink." He nodded curtly, his hand tightening on the doorknob. He was desperate to escape, to put as much distance as possible between himself and this unsettling encounter. As he reached for the door to open it, Sarah took a small step forward, subtly blocking his path. It was a slight movement, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to prevent him from leaving. He stopped, his back still to her. He seemed to deflate, his shoulders slumping even further. He knew he couldn't simply walk away, not without addressing the elephant in the room. The silence stretched between them once more, thick with unspoken tension. Sarah knew she had to say something, something that would acknowledge what had happened, something that would somehow salvage their relationship. But what could she possibly say? She was lost, adrift in a sea of regret and uncertainty. The moment of truth had arrived. The silence stretched, taut and unforgiving. Sarah knew she couldn't let him leave without acknowledging the seismic shift that had occurred between them. She had to force him to confront the reality of their altered dynamic. "Mr. Peterson," she said, her voice trembling slightly, Do you think things can ever be the same between us?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. It was a direct challenge, a demand for honesty. It forced him to acknowledge the unspoken desires, the blurred boundaries, the irreparable damage that had been done. He remained silent for a long moment, his back still to her. She could see his shoulders rising and falling with each labored breath. He was struggling, grappling with his conscience, battling against the temptation to simply deny everything and walk away. Finally, he turned around, his face etched with a mixture of pain and resignation. His eyes, once filled with warmth and kindness, now held a haunted look. I don't know, Sarah," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I honestly don't know." His words hung in the air, a stark admission of the profound change that had occurred. He couldn't deny it any longer. The grandfatherly facade had crumbled, revealing the complex, flawed human being beneath. Sarah had forced him to confront the truth, and in doing so, she had shattered their comfortable world forever. The consequences of her actions were now unavoidable. His confession hung in the air, a fragile truth exposed to the harsh light of reality. Sarah searched his eyes, desperate for some glimmer of hope, some indication that their friendship could be salvaged. But all she saw was confusion and regret. "But do you feel anything, Mr. Peterson?" she pressed, her voice barely a whisper. Are you attracted to me?" The question was a gamble, a desperate attempt to salvage something from the wreckage. If he denied it, she could perhaps pretend that the past few hours had been a figment of her imagination. But if he admitted it, then everything would change. Mr. Peterson closed his eyes, his face contorted with anguish. He remained silent for what felt like an eternity, battling against the conflicting desires that raged within him. Finally, he opened his eyes, his gaze locking with hers. "Yes, Sarah," he said, his voice thick with emotion. I can't deny it. I am attracted to you." The words hung in the air, heavy with consequence. It was a confession, a forbidden admission that shattered the boundaries of their relationship. The tension in the kitchen reached its peak, a suffocating pressure that threatened to explode. Sarah stared at him, her heart pounding in her chest. She had gotten the answer she had sought, but the truth was far more complicated than she had ever imagined. She had opened a door to a world of forbidden desires, and now she had to decide whether to step through it or slam it shut forever. The choice was hers. The weight of his confession pressed down on them, a suffocating blanket of forbidden desire. Sarah stared at Mr. Peterson, her mind racing, trying to process the implications of his words. He stood before her, a broken man, his face etched with regret and longing. She had sought to inject some excitement into her life, but she had unleashed a force far more powerful and dangerous than she had ever imagined. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken possibilities and looming consequences. Sarah knew that whatever happened next, their relationship would never be the same. The innocent bond they had shared for so many years had been irrevocably shattered, replaced by something far more complex and unsettling. Mr. Peterson took a step back, his hand reaching for the doorknob once more. I should go," he stammered, his voice barely audible. Sarah didn't try to stop him this time. She simply stood there, watching as he opened the door and stepped out into the bright sunlight. He paused for a moment on the porch, turning back to face her. His eyes were filled with a mixture of sadness and longing. He opened his mouth to say something, then hesitated, as if unable to find the words. Finally, he simply nodded curtly and turned away, walking slowly towards his own house next door. Sarah watched him go, her heart heavy with uncertainty. The future stretched before them, a vast and unknown territory filled with both danger and possibility. What would happen next? Would they ever speak again? Would they try to rebuild their friendship, or would they forever be haunted by the events of this fateful afternoon? The answers remained elusive, lost in the shadows of unspoken desires and shattered illusions. The door clicked softly shut, leaving Sarah alone in the kitchen, the scent of cinnamon and regret hanging heavy in the air.